My fiancé posted, "Normalize outgrowing relationships that keep you playing small," the morning after calling off our wedding in front of both families. I stayed silent through every rumor she spread about me. Months later, she deleted the post after her mother publicly revealed why I'd really walked away during Thanksgiving dinner. Normalize outgrowing relationships that keep you playing small. She said it at brunch. 11 in the morning, mimosas already halfway gone, sunlight cutting through the window of that overpriced bistro on the Upper West Side, where Vivian liked to be seen more than fed. She said it loudly enough that the table next to us could hear. Loudly enough that her friend Genevieve laughed first, which gave everyone else permission to laugh too. Everyone laughed. I didn't. Vivian smiled like she'd already won something. Like she'd landed a punchline at the end of a long joke I hadn't realized I was part of. She lifted her glass just slightly, this tiny performative gesture, and Genevieve clinked hers against it, and the two of them shared a look that I'd seen before. The kind of look that happens between people when they've already had the real conversation in private and what you're watching is just the public staging of conclusions already reached. That's so true, Genevieve said. People stay in things way too long out of guilt. Comfort, Vivian said. Fear of change. Fear of being alone. It takes courage, Genevieve agreed. Real courage to choose yourself. I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, set it back down. Nobody looked at me directly after that, which told me everything I needed to know about who the comment had been aimed at. Here's what I should tell you about Vivian before I go any further. She was brilliant at this. At making a public statement that technically targeted no one while leaving absolutely no doubt about who she meant. She had been doing it since the first year of our relationship. Little verbal photographs of private arguments, developed and displayed in front of friends under the guise of general wisdom. By the time we were engaged, she had an audience for it. People who followed her on Instagram, her circle of friends, even some of our mutual acquaintances. They all received these curated dispatches from inside our relationship, and they received only her version. I had let it go on for too long. At that brunch table, I sat quietly while the conversation moved on to other things. A trip someone was planning, a promotion Genevieve had recently gotten, the restaurant's new dinner menu. I ate my eggs. I listened. I said very little. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a door that had been creaking open for months finally swung wide. I didn't slam it. I didn't make a scene. I didn't lean across the table and ask Vivian what exactly she meant, because I already knew, and because I had learned, too slowly, too late, that asking Vivian to explain herself in public was exactly the kind of opening she wanted. A chance to reframe. A chance to perform composure while I appeared to be the one overreacting. So I said nothing. I paid my portion of the bill. I drove home with her in a silence that she filled with small talk I can no longer remember. And that night, I made a decision. The next morning, she posted it on Instagram. The quote, formatted cleanly over a soft focus background image. Normalize outgrowing relationships that keep you playing small. 247 likes by the time I saw it. Comments like this is everything, and you always know exactly what to say, and a crown emoji from Genevieve that had already accumulated 14 replies. I looked at the post for a long moment. Then I put my phone down, made myself coffee, and started making calls. I should have walked away right then. The day I called off the wedding, it rained. Not dramatically, not the kind of rain that announces itself in movies, where the sky cracks open right as someone makes a speech. It was a gray, quiet, indifferent rain, the kind that doesn't care about your timing. Both families were already assembled at Vivian's parents' house in Westchester. Her mother Eliza's idea, a pre-wedding Sunday gathering framed as a relaxed family lunch. Something casual, something to bring everyone together before the rehearsal dinner that Thursday. There were maybe 22 people in that house. Her parents, her aunt, and 2 cousins, a handful of family friends including Josephine and Reed, who had been coming to the Aldridge family gathering since before Vivian and I had even met. On my side, my parents, my cousin Harrison, 2 of my closest friends. Everyone dressed like they were trying to look like they hadn't tried too hard. Food on the table. Wine already opened. I arrived knowing what I was going to do. I want to be clear about something, because this detail matters. I did not plan to do it there, in front of everyone. My original intention had been to speak to Vivian privately, to have the conversation with just the 2 of us, to do it with some degree of dignity. But when I arrived, she was already in the middle of a story she was telling to both families together, something about the venue's floral arrangements, and she looked up when I walked in, and something shifted in her expression. Just briefly. A flicker of something I couldn't entirely name. And I realized, in that moment, that there was no private version of this that Vivian would allow to remain private. That whatever happened between us alone, she would translate for her audience, and that translation would not resemble the original. So when she finished her story and the room settled into that comfortable in-between conversational lull, I said it quietly but clearly. I need to say something to everyone here before this goes any further. The room went still the way rooms do when something unexpected shifts the air. I'm not going to be able to marry Vivian. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver it like a speech. It came out measured and flat, because that was all I had left, not coldness, but exhaustion. The silence lasted about 4 full seconds. Then her aunt made a small sound. Then Vivian's father said my name with a question mark attached to it. Vivian herself said nothing immediately. This was the first thing that surprised people, I think. Later, various family members would mention it when recounting the moment. They expected tears, or anger, or some immediate emotional response. What they got instead was Vivian, very deliberately, setting down her glass of wine, smoothing her dress, and then lifting her eyes to the room with an expression that was somehow both wounded and composed, and saying, "I think we should talk about this privately," which sounded like the reasonable request of a reasonable woman. And I said, "There's nothing left to discuss privately," which, to anyone who didn't know the full context, probably sounded like cruelty. I watched it happen in real time. The way the room's sympathies organized themselves based on almost no information. My mother's face collapsed. Harrison looked at me with something between confusion and quiet alarm. Josephine, who had known the Aldridge family for decades, reached instinctively for Eliza's arm. Reed, who I had always found difficult to read, looked at me with an expression I wouldn't understand until much later. Vivian began to cry, softly, controlledly, in a way that might have been entirely genuine. I was no longer certain I could tell the difference. And when she cried, the room moved toward her. Physically, her mother stood up. Genevieve, who had arrived with another friend, went to her side. And I stood in the middle of the room, having just set off what felt like a detonation, and I said nothing else. Nothing I could have said in that moment would have helped. I knew that. Any explanation I offered would have been heard through the lens of what had just happened. A man who had just publicly humiliated his fiancée in front of both families was not going to be given the benefit of the doubt in the next 30 seconds, regardless of his reasons. Harrison pulled me aside gently, led me to the kitchen, poured me a glass of water I didn't drink. "Are you okay?" he said. "No," I said honestly. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" "Not right now." He nodded. He didn't push. Harrison has always known when not to push. We left the house about 40 minutes later, after the kind of quiet, terrible maneuvering that happens when a social gathering has suddenly become something no one planned for. People finding their coats, saying incomplete sentences, giving Vivian one more hug or squeeze of the shoulder before filtering out. My parents were confused. My mother held my arm in the parking lot and asked me in a low voice if I was sure, if I had thought this through, if something specific had happened that I could tell her. "I'll explain later," I said. "People are going to have questions," she said. "I know," I said. One person, I would find out later it was Reed, noticed something before he left. He told Harrison about it weeks later, and Harrison told me. What Reed had noticed was Eliza, Vivian's mother. While everyone else in that house had moved toward Vivian, had clustered around her, had offered comfort and confused outrage on her behalf, Eliza had stood at the edge of the room, not moving toward her daughter, not joining the gathering comfort, just standing there, Reed said, with an expression nobody could quite describe. Nobody paid attention to it at the time. The post went up 48 hours after the gathering. Not the first one. The first one was subtle, artful, almost deniable. A quote about seasons of life, about the people we choose and the people who choose less than what we deserve. The caption said nothing specific. It didn't have to. Her 4,200 followers, cultivated over years of carefully curated content about lifestyle and relationships and personal growth, understood the assignment. The comments arrived immediately, and they were unanimous. "You deserve so much better. Protecting your peace is everything. A real one would never." And of course, reliably, the crown emojis. Then came the second post. A close-up of her hand, engagement ring notably absent, captioned, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself before the altar does it for you." Then the third, a selfie, soft lighting, eyes that communicated precisely the right amount of recovered strength. Healing is not linear. but it is possible. By the end of the week, the narrative had been written, and the narrator was not me. I watched this happen from a careful distance, the way you watch a controlled burn from outside the perimeter, something destructive, but structured, producing a specific result. Vivian was not raging. She was not attacking. She was performing recovery, and the performance was immaculate, and it told a story in which she was a woman who had narrowly escaped something small. Something small was me. The rumors followed the posts the way smoke follows fire. You couldn't always trace the exact point of origin, but you could watch where it traveled. By the second week, I was hearing secondhand accounts of things I had apparently done and said. From Graham, my best friend, who had sources in the mutual social circle we shared with Vivian. I heard that the prevailing version of events went something like this. I had gotten cold feet because I was emotionally unavailable, possibly because of unresolved issues from my family. That I had been dismissive of Vivian's feelings for years. That the public setting of the breakup was itself proof of some pathology, some need to humiliate rather than simply communicate. None of this was stated as accusation. It circulated as concern. As I heard he was dealing with some things, and apparently there were red flags for a while, and I just feel so bad for her. She gave him everything. Mutual friends began making calculations the way people do when a social group fractures, quietly, privately, resolving where their allegiances lay before any formal declaration was required. Some of them I lost in the first week. Others lingered in an ambiguous middle space, still texting occasionally, still technically present, but with a new careful quality to the contact, like they were taking notes. Family members on the periphery stopped calling. An aunt who had always been warm sent me a brief, formal message saying she hoped I was well. 2 college friends who had met Vivian at various gatherings over the years went quiet on group chats. One of them, someone I'd known for 8 years, posted a comment on one of Vivian's photos that said simply, "You are so strong." I did not comment. I did not post. I did not send any clarifying messages to the people who were drifting away or defend myself to the mutual friends who were clearly receiving a version of events I hadn't authored. Graham called me one night during the second week and said, "You know, people are starting to think some real things about you." "I know," I said. "And you're just going to let them think it?" "For now," I said. Long pause on the line. "Is there a reason?" he asked. "There's a reason," I said. "I'll tell you when the time is right." Another pause. "Okay," he said finally. Which is one of the things I have always appreciated about Graham. He knows when someone has made a decision, and he doesn't mistake patience for weakness. Here is what nobody on the outside could see during those weeks. I was not silent because I had no defense. I was silent because my defense involved information that wasn't entirely mine to broadcast, involving people beyond just Vivian, involving a conversation that had taken place in private and that I had not yet decided how to handle. I was sitting with something that felt less like a secret I was keeping for my own protection and more like a fragile thing I didn't yet know how to carry in public. And underneath all of it, I was waiting. Not for revenge. Not for the right moment to detonate my side of the story. Just waiting. The way you wait for something inevitable. For the truth to find its own surface. Because the thing about truth, I had come to understand this slowly, over the course of a relationship that had spent 3 years trying to bury it, is that it does not disappear when you refuse to speak it. It waits. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. We met at a work event. Not each other's work. A conference where multiple industries overlapped in that particular Manhattan way, everyone holding drinks and exchanging cards and performing their professional selves at a slightly elevated register. She was in marketing. I was in architecture. We were introduced by someone whose name I no longer remember, and within 10 minutes we had found the corner of the room farthest from the sponsored cocktail table and were deep in a conversation that felt genuinely effortless. That was the thing about Vivian in the beginning. She was effortless, funny and smart and specific in her references, the kind of person who never said anything generic, who always seemed to have a more interesting version of the obvious observation. I was 31. I hadn't felt that kind of immediate connection in years. I let myself be completely unguarded about it. The first small moment came about 4 months in. We were at dinner with 2 of her friends, people I didn't know well yet, and I made a comment about a project I was working on, something I was proud of, a residential redesign that had some genuinely complex engineering problems I'd been solving for weeks. And Vivian laughed. Not meanly. There was no visible edge to it. She just laughed and said, "He's always talking about his little building puzzles. and moved the conversation forward. Little building puzzles. I didn't say anything. The dinner moved on. Later that night, I told myself I was being too sensitive, that she hadn't meant it as diminishment, that she was probably just trying to keep the conversation accessible to her friends. But I remembered it. 6 months in, we were at a gallery opening, the kind of event Vivian loved. Visible, crowded with people who cared about being seen at things like this. She introduced me to someone as my boyfriend. He does architecture, like designing office interiors. I don't design office interiors. The work I do is considerably more complex, and she knew that. We'd discussed it at length. But it was a small correction to make in a loud room to someone I'd just met, and I made the calculation in real time. Not worth it. I started making that calculation frequently. Not worth it. Not here. Not in front of these people. Not when she's in this particular mood. The calculations accumulated. There was an evening, about a year in, at a dinner party hosted by one of her colleagues. I had been included, as I often was, as a kind of accessory to Vivian's social life. Present but not particularly integrated, seated next to people I had no context for, expected to be pleasant and low maintenance. At one point the table turned to a discussion about a significant infrastructure project that had just been announced for the city, a bridge renovation with some genuinely interesting design components. It was the first topic all evening that I had actual expertise in, and I started to explain something about the engineering approach they'd likely be taking. Vivian touched my arm and said, with a smile directed at the table rather than at me, "He could honestly talk about structural load distribution for hours. It's adorable." The table laughed. I stopped talking. Adorable. Not impressive. Not fascinating. Adorable. The word you use to describe the enthusiasms of someone who doesn't quite fit the room. She had taken my competence and framed it as a quirk, a personality trait to be indulged, and she had done it in front of 8 people with a smile so warm that I would have seemed absurd to object. I looked at her after the laughter settled. She was already talking about something else. The image obsession was constant. Vivian cared about appearances with an intensity that I had initially mistaken for ambition. She cared about where we ate and how the table looked in the photograph before we ordered. She cared about our couple profile, the story of us as it was visible to the outside, the combined image we projected at events, in photos, in the way mutual friends described us to other people. She was always managing it, refining it, adjusting the exposure. There was a conversation I had with Eliza, Vivian's mother, about 8 months before the engagement. We happened to be alone in the kitchen during a family gathering at the Aldridge house, the kind of accidental privacy that happens at large family events when everyone else drifts to another room. Eliza was washing something at the sink. I was refilling my glass, and she said, without looking up, "Vivian has always needed a particular kind of man." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said, "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a moment. "Someone patient," she said finally. "Very patient." She glanced at me briefly, then back to the sink. I sometimes wonder if she knows what that costs the person who provides it. Then someone called from the other room, and the moment dissolved. At the time, I heard it as a mother offering an oblique warning that I interpreted as general relationship advice. I filed it away in the back of my mind as something I half understood. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I didn't follow up. I should have. It was Genevieve, of all people, who started asking questions. Genevieve had been Vivian's closest friend for almost a decade. They'd met in college, maintained the friendship through moves and career changes and other relationships, and by the time I entered the picture, Genevieve had the particular status of inner circle that came with long shared history. She was present at most gatherings. She knew things. She was, in many ways, Vivian's primary audience, and I had always understood that being in Vivian's life meant being accountable, to some degree, to Genevieve's assessment of you. Which is why, about 6 weeks after the breakup, the call I received from Genevieve surprised me. I almost didn't answer. But something, curiosity, maybe, or the stubborn refusal to assume the worst of everyone, made me pick up. "I want to ask you something," she said. No preamble. "Okay," I said. "And I want you to know I'm not asking on her behalf. I'm asking for myself." "Okay." Pause. "She told me you ended it because you'd never really been committed, that you were always looking for an exit, that the public setting was a power move." Another pause. "Is that true?" "No," I said. "Then what is true?" "I can't fully explain it right now, Genevieve." "That's not an answer." "I know it isn't, but it's what I have right now." Long silence. "Then, there are inconsistencies." I waited. Things she said don't line up with other things she's said. About the timeline. about certain events. Genevieve's voice had a careful quality, like she was measuring out the words. I've noticed it for a while. But after everything happened, I started paying closer attention. What kind of inconsistencies? I asked, though I already suspected. She told our friend's circle that you had refused to attend couples counseling, that you declined 3 times when she suggested it. She stopped. But I was there when she brought it up, once a year ago. And you agreed to go. She was the one who never scheduled the first appointment. The silence that followed that statement was significant. Graham had been asking questions too, but from a different angle, less about the narrative inconsistencies and more about the mechanics. Graham is an engineer by training and by temperament, which means he thinks about how things are constructed and what happens when the construction is faulty. He called me one afternoon and said, "I've been doing the math on some things." "What things?" I said. "The timeline, when you two first got engaged, and some things that were happening professionally for you around that time." He let that sit. "I talked to a couple of people who know you both. Not to dig, just, I was trying to understand. And there's a version of this story that's not the version she's telling." "There is," I said. "You know I'm here if you want to tell me." "I do know that," I said. "And I will. Just not yet." What Graham was beginning to see, and what I hadn't yet confirmed for him, was something that had taken me a long time to assemble from fragments, and then longer to accept once I had assembled it. There was a pattern underneath the pattern. The public diminishments, the managed image, the careful social media narrative, these were not random behaviors. They were components of something more deliberate. Vivian's stories, as Genevieve was starting to notice, changed depending on the audience. With her social media following, she was the wounded party recovering from a man who had never shown up. With her closer friends, who might notice contradictions, the story had subtle variations, more ambiguity, more of a "we both had our issues" framing. With her family, it was something else entirely, calibrated to what they needed to hear. The problem with maintaining multiple versions of a story is that people talk to each other. Josephine, the family friend who'd been at that Sunday gathering, ran into Graham at an event neither of them had planned to attend. They didn't know each other well, but they had me in common, and the conversation eventually found its way to the breakup. What Josephine said to Graham, and what Graham relayed to me, was this. At the gathering that day, before everything happened, I saw Eliza pull Vivian into the hallway. They were arguing. Not loudly, but Eliza had her by the arm, and they were very intense. And then you arrived, and everything changed. No one had mentioned this detail before. Someone had discovered something that shifted the entire shape of the story. And the audience, everyone in Vivian's orbit, everyone who had accepted the prevailing narrative without question, still had no idea what it was. Everett appeared in Vivian's life with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting nearby. He was photographed with her about 6 weeks after the breakup. Not dramatically, not as a formal announcement, but in the way these introductions happen in the social media era. A group photo from a rooftop gathering where he was standing next to her, and then a week later a photo where he was standing a little closer, and then, without any particular declaration, just present in the landscape of her posts in a way that communicated everything while stating nothing. He was good-looking in an obvious, catalog-ready way. Finance, apparently, based on what information surfaced through the mutual acquaintance network. Tall, gym-built, dressed with the particular care of a man who had been told his appearance was one of his primary assets and had taken that information seriously. He smiled easily in photos. He seemed to enjoy being photographed, which made him a natural fit for Vivian's visual world. The reactions were quick and enthusiastic. Her followers, many of whom had spent weeks rallying around her recovery content, greeted Everett as confirmation that the universe had corrected an injustice. "See, God had better planned," someone commented. "Upgrade energy," from Genevieve, which I read and felt nothing about. "He looks at her like she deserves to be looked at," from a follower I didn't recognize, which was a specific and interesting kind of commentary given that no one outside our relationship had ever actually seen how I looked at Vivian. But the performance of it was aimed at me. I understood that clearly. The frequency of posts, the particular framing of the photos, Everett's arm around her, her face tilted up toward him in ways that photographed beautifully. It was content, and the content had an intended audience of one. She wanted a reaction. I didn't give her one. This was not a strategy, exactly. It wasn't calculated composure deployed for effect. It was more that I had simply run out of the kind of emotional energy that produces reactions. I looked at the post the way I might look at weather through a window. Noted it. Did not engage with it. Moved on. Graham asked me once if it bothered me, seeing her with someone else. I said, yeah. I thought about it honestly. Less than I expected, I said. Which was true. What I felt looking at those photos was not the sharp pain of jealousy, but something duller and more complicated. A mild, almost abstract sadness, the kind you feel not about the specific loss, but about the cumulative decisions that had led you to a place where loss was the only remaining option. What I did notice, in those early weeks of the Everett era, were the small anomalies that the enthusiastic commentary seemed to skip past. He appeared in her content consistently, but he never posted about her. His own social media, which I looked at exactly once, out of a curiosity I felt mildly embarrassed about, was sparse and odd, with large gaps and a following that skewed in a demographic direction that didn't quite match the professional image he was presenting. Harrison mentioned, offhandedly, that a friend of his had encountered Everett at an event months earlier, before the breakup, before any of this, and had found him memorable for the wrong reasons. Vague reasons. The kind of reasons people mention but don't specify when they're not sure if their information is solid. I filed it away. I didn't broadcast it. I didn't tell Genevieve or plant seeds in the mutual network. Because whatever Everett was or wasn't, it wasn't my information to circulate, and more fundamentally, whatever happened in Vivian's new relationship was no longer my responsibility. I had not left her to protect myself from her. I had left because of what I knew, and what I knew was sufficient, and everything that came after was just the story finding its own ending. I went back to work. I declined 2 invitations to gatherings where I knew she would be present. I cooked dinner at home on a Friday night and watched something I'd been meaning to watch for a year and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The Everett phase was underway. I let it run. Here is the boring truth about what I actually did in the months following the end of my engagement. I worked. Not dramatically. Not in the montage sense, where the camera cuts between a series of power poses and conference room victories. I worked the way architects work, slowly, carefully, with long periods of staring at a problem from multiple angles before touching it. I went into the office early. I stayed later than usual, not to impress anyone, but because the alternative was going home to an apartment that still had small traces of Vivian's presence in it. A particular throw blanket, a coffee table book she'd left, a framed print she'd hung that I kept forgetting to take down. Work was clean. Work had clear problems with discoverable solutions. I found comfort in that. A project I'd been developing for nearly 2 years, a mixed-use residential building on the edge of Brooklyn, the kind of design work that required something close to a complete reimagining of how a particular block related to its neighborhood, had reached a stage where it needed my full attention. I gave it that. I gave it more than that. I came in on weekends. I brought in a structural engineer I'd been wanting to collaborate with for years, and we spent 3 weeks working through a set of problems that neither of us had clean answers to. And eventually, we found solutions that were genuinely new. It got noticed. Not loudly. Architecture is not a field in which notice tends to arrive loudly, unless you are already famous, but meaningfully. A firm I had long admired reached out with an inquiry. A publication that covered design and urban development asked to feature the project. A conversation began that, by late fall, would become a formal offer for a collaboration I'd been working toward for the better part of a decade. I didn't post about any of it. No LinkedIn announcement. No Instagram story from the office. Nothing that could be read as performance or positioning. I just let the work happen. I started running again, which I had stopped doing during the last year of the relationship when I couldn't quite explain where the time had gone. 3 mornings a week at first, then 5. I dropped 12 pounds that I hadn't realized I was carrying. I slept better. I cooked actual meals instead of the maintenance-level eating I'd been doing for months. None of this was revenge. I want to be precise about that, because there's a tendency in stories like this to frame every positive development as a countermove in some ongoing competition. That's not what this was. I wasn't building a better version of myself to show Vivian what she'd lost. I was building a better version of myself because I had been losing myself incrementally for 3 years, and I had not noticed until the loss was nearly complete, and now I was simply, quietly, without announcement, in the process of recovery. Graham noticed. He started showing up on Saturday mornings occasionally, not for any stated reason, just to be around. We'd get coffee and walk, and he'd ask me real questions about how I was doing, and I'd give him real answers, and this was more helpful than I can adequately describe. He told me once, around the 3rd month, "You seem more like yourself than you have in a while." "That's because I am," I said. "How long do you think it took," he said, "to get, I don't know, lost in it?" I thought about that for a block or two. I don't think it happened at once, I said. I think it was a lot of very small moments where I chose not to push back. And they added up. He nodded. She started watching again, he said casually. Watching what? You. Your work stuff. She's been asking mutual people questions about how you're doing. He said it without drama, without implication. Just reporting. Not obsessively. Just checking. I didn't respond immediately. She wants to know if you're struggling, I said finally. Probably, he said. She isn't getting that. No, he said. She really isn't. We kept walking. The city moved around us, indifferent and alive, and I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel, genuinely fine. Everett's behavior changed in September. I know this only because the mutual network, that loosely connected social ecosystem that had once organized itself around Vivian's narrative of wronged strength, began generating different information. Not from me. I was not a node in that network anymore, or at least not an active one. But Graham still was, and Harrison still was, and Genevieve, who had quietly begun occupying an uncertain middle position, was hearing things. The first indication was financial. Someone who knew Everett's social circle mentioned, with the studied casualness of gossip that doesn't want to be identified as gossip, that Everett's situation wasn't exactly what he presented. The finance background was accurate in the narrow sense that he worked in finance, but the nature of that work, the stability of it, the level at which he operated, had been, apparently, gently inflated. When Vivian began involving him in conversations about their future, about what a shared life might look like, about locations and timelines, and the kind of financial stability required to make certain choices, inconsistencies had begun surfacing. Vivian, to her credit or her detriment, depending on how you looked at it, doubled down. Her posts, if anything, became more curated during this period, the image of the relationship more deliberately maintained. More couple photos, more sunny captions, more of the visual language that communicates happiness so insistently it starts to have the opposite effect. But the arguments were filtering out. Second and third parties reporting overhearing things, noticing tones, reading the subtle distress signals that Vivian, who was so skilled at projecting a composed surface, couldn't always prevent from leaking at the edges. A dinner where she'd seemed diminished, somehow. A gathering where she'd arrived without Everett and explained his absence with a story that felt rehearsed. Genevieve called me again in October. I'm not going to pretend I'm not worried about her, she said. But I also can't pretend I don't notice things. What kind of things? He lies, she said simply. Small things. Specific things. About where he's been. About conversations that happened. About what he said and what he didn't say. She stopped. It's very familiar. Genevieve. I'm not making an accusation. I'm just saying. She let that sit between us. The way she talks about him when she thinks no one's really listening. It doesn't match what she says publicly. And I know that gap. I've seen it before. I didn't fill the silence. I owe you an apology, she said after a moment. You don't have to. I assumed. Based on what she told me. And I was vocal about it, and that wasn't fair. Her voice was composed, but careful. I should have asked more questions. It's okay, I said, and mostly meant it. Meanwhile, Eliza, Vivian's mother, was learning things. Not from me, not from Graham, not from any external source I was aware of. From her daughter, in the way mothers learn things they haven't been told, in fragments, in tones, in the small faltering moments that escape even the most practiced performances. What Eliza was learning, and what she was carrying in silence, and what she had been carrying, I would later understand, since well before the breakup, was something that changed the shape of everything. She kept it secret through October. She kept it secret through the first week of November. She was still keeping it at the start of the Thanksgiving holiday week. But she was running out of reasons to. By November, the Aldrich family was no longer a single unit in relation to what had happened. This happens in extended families after a rupture. The surface remains intact, because families are very good at maintaining surfaces, but underneath there are fractures running in multiple directions, and if you know where to press, you can feel them. On one side, Vivian's aunt and her two cousins, who had accepted the original narrative completely and whose affection for Vivian was deep enough to resist contradiction. They had watched her posts. They had seen the progression from wounded strength to tentative new hope. They had rooted for her at every stage, which meant they had, necessarily, rooted against me, and repositioning was not something they were inclined toward. On the other side, Reed, who had noticed Eliza's strange stillness on the day of the gathering and had been turning it over in his mind ever since. And Josephine, who had mentioned the argument between Eliza and Vivian in the hallway before I arrived, and who had a long memory and a careful disposition and had been watching the months unfold with a quietness that suggested she was still making sense of something. And Eliza herself, standing not on one side or the other, but at some point that couldn't be mapped onto the family's existing fault lines, holding information that made the map itself inaccurate. Old wedding discussions had started resurfacing in November, in the way that old topics do when a family is heading toward a gathering. Thanksgiving was at the Aldridge home. It always was, had been for years, including the years before I had ever been part of the picture. My invitation this year had been extended through a route that I found surprising, not from Vivian, obviously, but from Eliza. Directly. A phone call, brief and precise. "I'd like you to come," she said, "if you're willing." "Is Vivian aware you're inviting me?" I said. "She will be," she said. "Not she is. She will be." I was quiet for a moment. "Eliza, is there something you want to tell me?" "Yes," she said, "but not over the phone." "Okay," I said. "I'll come." I told Graham. He offered to come with me, which I appreciated, and declined. Harrison asked if I wanted company for the drive up, and I told him I was fine, and then reconsidered and said yes. In the mutual network, news of my invitation spread, selectively, imperfectly, in the incomplete way that such things always travel. For some of Vivian's family members and friends, the news was simply confusing. Why would Eliza invite him? For others, those who had been sitting with their own quiet confusion for months, it felt like something was finally about to resolve. People compared stories in those weeks, the way you compare notes after an event when you're trying to triangulate what actually happened. Two people who had been at that Sunday gathering separately mentioned to each other that Eliza had seemed strange that day. Someone else produced a detail nobody had been aware of, that Eliza had called the original venue coordinator the week before the gathering. No one could explain why. And there was the question of the conversation, the one that kept getting referenced in fragments, never complete. A conversation that had happened before the wedding. Private. Between Eliza and Vivian. Details unknown, but its existence confirmed now by multiple parties who had heard different pieces from different angles. Nobody knew what had been said. Thanksgiving was in 12 days. I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone in full. Just a piece of it, enough for the shape to start making sense. About a month before I called off the wedding, Vivian told me something about money. Not directly. Vivian never did anything directly when an indirect approach was available. But the information came out during a conversation about our joint financial planning. A conversation we'd been having in pieces for months, the way engaged couples do, building a picture of what shared life would actually look like. Who handles what? What we each bring to the table. What we're each working toward. The thing she told me, framed in a way that made it sound like disclosure, but was actually designed to pass unexamined, was this. There was debt. Not the ordinary manageable kind. Not student loans or a car note or the reasonable accumulation of a person who has lived in an expensive city and made some imperfect financial decisions. There was a specific, significant, structural debt, and attached to it, when I pulled gently at the thread over several subsequent conversations, was a history of decisions she had made and not made, of obligations she had accumulated and obscured, of a financial reality that was radically inconsistent with the image she maintained. This alone would not have been cause for me to leave. People carry debt. People make mistakes. What mattered was not the debt itself, but everything that surrounded it. The concealment, deliberate and sustained over the entire duration of our relationship. The way she had shaped her relationship with me around this concealment, ensuring that certain conversations never happened, that certain questions were deflected before they could be fully asked. The financial picture she had been projecting to friends, to family, to social media, the restaurant brunches and weekend trips and expensive decor, all of it, which bore no relationship to the reality she was actually living. And layered on top of this, the reason she had wanted to marry me was not entirely the reason she had presented. The life I represented, the stability I offered, the specific financial trajectory of my career had been factored into her calculations in a way that felt, once I saw it clearly, less like love and more like strategy. I do not say this to be cruel about her. I say it because it is what I came to understand, and because understanding it changed the meaning of everything that had come before. When I went over the numbers with a clear head, and then went over 3 years of decisions with the same clarity, what I saw was this. I had been, from a fairly early stage, part of Vivian's solution to a problem she had never acknowledged having. The breakup was not impulsive. It was the conclusion of about 2 weeks of quiet, methodical processing. During those 2 weeks, I spoke to no one except Harrison, briefly, and a financial consultant I knew professionally who helped me understand the full extent of what I was looking at. When I arrived at that Sunday family gathering and made the decision to say what I said in front of everyone, it was not because I wanted to humiliate her. It was because I had finally stopped making the calculation of not worth it here. The reaction, as I've described, was swift and certain in its direction. Nobody knew why I had really done it. Nobody had the information that would have reframed the scene. But Eliza did. Because Eliza, as I would eventually learn, had known about the debt for 3 years. Had known, in fact, longer than I had. Had had a conversation with her daughter, specific, direct, documented in the way a mother documents a serious conversation with her child, by writing about it afterward, by keeping a kind of quiet record of what was said and what was refused and what never changed. She had kept it from her husband. She had kept it from me. She had carried it through the engagement, through the planning, through months of watching a situation build toward a reckoning that she had seen coming and could not prevent. The day of the gathering, in that hallway, before I arrived, she had tried one final time. Vivian had refused to listen. And then I walked in. The biggest piece of this, the part that would take everyone's breath away, Eliza was still keeping. For now. Everett was exposed in early November. Not by me. Not by anyone acting on my behalf. By the natural erosion of maintained fictions, which have a structural limit that is eventually reached regardless of the effort applied to preserving them. He had been presenting, to Vivian and to their shared social orbit, a professional identity that was partially fabricated. The details, as they emerged through the social network over the course of about a week, were less dramatic than the structure they'd been concealing. It wasn't fraud in any legal sense. It was the ordinary misrepresentation of a man who had inflated his position, his assets, and his trajectory in order to access a world that would not have received him accurately. He was not who he had said he was, and the delta between the presentation and the reality was significant enough that, once people began comparing notes, the picture changed rapidly. Vivian had been living partly inside the performance he'd constructed. Some of what she'd put on social media, the dinners, the weekend in the Hamptons, the easy affluence of those photos, had been supported by what turned out to be borrowed money and a credit situation that was not sustainable. When this came to light, Vivian did what she always did. She attempted to control the narrative. Posts were quietly revised. The Hamptons content disappeared. The couple photos thinned out without any announcement, and then stopped entirely. And then came a post that was unmistakably a breakup post, even though it named nothing and no one. Something about recognizing your patterns and refusing to repeat them. Something about deserving the kind of love that doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller. The irony of that particular caption, given its predecessor, was not lost on the people who had been paying attention. Friends who had rallied hard around the Vivian and Everett narrative now faced a small reckoning. Not enough to produce public acknowledgement, people rarely do that, but enough to produce a quiet withdrawal from the positions they'd taken. Comments disappeared. The social media support network became a little thinner, a little less vocal. Genevieve had been pulling back for weeks already. She was too honest a person, ultimately, to keep performing a certainty she no longer had. She told me later that watching the Everett situation unfold had been clarifying in a way that was uncomfortable, not because it proved anything specific about what had happened between Vivian and me, but because it revealed something about the patterns, about what Vivian was consistently drawn toward and why, about what image had always been required to conceal. The posts began coming down. Not all of them, just certain ones. The ones that had served a specific rhetorical purpose and were now more liability than asset. The carefully crafted recovery content from the early months after the breakup. The empowerment quotes. A few of the Everett photos that hadn't been scrubbed yet. And there, I checked, because I am human and I was curious, the original post. Still up. Normalize outgrowing relationships that keep you playing small. Still there, still accumulating the slow passive drift of old engagement. For now, Eliza, meanwhile, had made a decision. I didn't know this yet. Harrison told me afterward that she'd apparently spent a long evening on the phone with Reed, who was the closest thing she had to a neutral party. Someone who had been present for much of the history, who had respect for both the Aldridge family and for me, and who could receive what she was carrying without it immediately becoming a family emergency. What she had told Reed on the phone, Harrison said, was enough that Reed had sat in silence for a full 10 seconds before responding. She couldn't stay quiet anymore. She was going to say something at Thanksgiving. The week before Thanksgiving had its own texture. It was the kind of week where everyone involved was moving towards something they could feel but not fully describe. Not everyone knew what was coming. In fact, very few people did. But there was a collective, wordless awareness that this gathering was not going to be like previous gatherings, that something had shifted in the structural load-bearing elements of this family and its extended circle, and that the holiday gathering was where the full weight of it was going to land. Vivian knew I'd been invited. She had not called me about it, had not texted, had not made any public comment. What she had done, according to Genevieve, was confront her mother privately about it. The confrontation had apparently not gone the way she expected. Eliza had been, in Genevieve's second-hand account, calm in a way that was worse than anger, the kind of calm that belongs to a person who has made a decision and reached the specific stillness that follows it. Harrison drove up with me on the Wednesday evening. We talked about other things, his work, a trip he was planning, a movie we'd both seen. He didn't ask me how I was feeling about the next day, and I appreciated that. Some things don't benefit from rehearsal. The Aldrich house in Westchester was the kind of house that looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was, the home of a family that had organized its life around the idea of appearing solid. Large, well-maintained, the kind of place where holidays happened correctly, the right decorations, the right number of leaves in the dining room table, the meal timed and presented with the care of people for whom these events are performances of a shared identity. I arrived at noon. The house was already occupied. Vivian's aunt was in the kitchen with Eliza. The cousins were in the living room. Reed was there, standing near the window with the particular stillness of someone who is watching a room rather than being in it. He made eye contact with me when I came in and gave me a nod that meant something, though I couldn't entirely decode it. Vivian was there. We acknowledged each other with the careful minimalism of two people who have a long history and are choosing, in this particular moment, not to access any of it. A brief look, a nod. She looked tired in a way that her makeup almost covered. I thought, with something that wasn't satisfaction or grief, but perhaps just recognition. She knows something is happening. The meal would be at 2. There were 2 hours of the particular social performance of a Thanksgiving gathering, which is to say, pleasantries and wine, and an overcrowding of people in a kitchen that doesn't really benefit from overcrowding, and the deliberate avoidance of any topic with genuine weight. I found a moment to stand near Eliza at the kitchen counter, briefly. She was slicing something with focused attention. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, not looking up. "Thank you for asking," I said. She looked up then, and her expression held something I recognized as the look of a person at the end of a long period of carrying something alone. Exhausted and resolved simultaneously. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "Eliza, I know why you left," she said. Her voice was barely above a murmur. "And I've known a version of it longer than you have. And I stayed quiet because I kept thinking she would change it herself. Fix it herself. Tell you herself." She shook her head. She didn't. Someone called from the other room, and the moment dissolved, and we were just 2 people at a kitchen counter again. But the clock had started. The table was full. 14 people in the dining room. Vivian's parents, her aunt, and 2 cousins, Josephine and Reed, Harrison, Graham, who had come after all because he had a gift for reading situations correctly, Genevieve sitting in a position that made me think she was not entirely sure which side of this evening's geometry she occupied, 2 of Eliza's siblings who had come in from New Jersey, and Vivian. And me, at the end of the table that felt both neutral and loaded. The first hour was the meal itself, which is to say it was mostly functional. Passing dishes, commentary on the food, the kind of small cross-conversations that happen in large groups where the table is too wide for a single shared discussion. Vivian was seated at the opposite end from me. She was performing normalcy with visible effort, and performing it well enough that the 2 cousins seemed entirely at ease, and the New Jersey relatives, who had less context for the situation, seemed simply to be having Thanksgiving. But the undercurrent was there. Reed was watching. Josephine was watching. Harrison made eye contact with me once, briefly, with an expression that said, "I don't know exactly what's coming, but I know something is coming." The dishes were cleared. Coffee was offered. The table settled into that post-meal looseness, conversations bifurcating and overlapping, the room warming with wine and food, and the collective relaxation of people who have finished the formal portion of the event. And then Vivian's aunt, with the total innocence of someone who genuinely has no idea they're about to strike a match near an open gas line, said, "It's so funny to all be together like this. We haven't all been in this house since, well. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The table went slightly quieter. The ellipsis in the aunt's sentence floated above the table like something with mass. Vivian said, with the practiced calm of someone ready to manage this, a lot has changed since then. I think we've all grown from it. Grown from it. The echo of her earlier language. She was still using the framework. The table murmured vaguely, the social equivalent of nodding without committing to anything. And then Eliza set down her coffee cup. It was such a small gesture. The cup made almost no sound against the saucer. But something in the quality of the movement made the table pay attention. A stillness settled, the kind that arrives when a room senses without knowing why that what comes next is significant. I have something I'd like to say, Eliza said. Her voice was clear and even. Not loud. The table had to lean in slightly, which meant the table was already quiet. Vivian looked at her mother. Something moved through her face, recognition, and then a kind of alarm she was trying to suppress, and then the rapid internal calculation of a person trying to determine if she can stop what's coming. Mom, let me finish, please, Eliza said. Still even, still clear, not harsh, just immovable. And Vivian, for the first time, in my experience, in front of an audience, said nothing. The table waited. Eliza folded her hands on the table in front of her. She looked at the middle distance for a moment, the way people do when they are organizing something they've been organizing in private for a long time and are now about to release into a different kind of air. I owe a number of people in this room an honest account of some things, she said, and I've been waiting too long to give it. Eliza spoke for 11 minutes. I know the duration because afterward, Harrison mentioned it, having checked his watch at the beginning and end in the involuntary way people time significant events. 11 minutes. It was not a long speech. It was a precise one. She began with the debt. Not the way I had discovered it. Not from my angle of entry. She began with what she knew, which was older and more complete than what I had assembled in those final weeks before the breakup. She had learned about her daughter's financial situation 4 years ago, she said. A figure, not a vague acknowledgement, but a specific number, stated plainly, that made one of Vivian's cousins go very still across the table. The debt had been accumulated through a specific pattern of choices over the better part of a decade. A lifestyle maintained through credit, through deferred payments, through a series of decisions that each made sense in isolation and constituted, in aggregate, something she could not sustain alone. I thought, Eliza said, that if I gave her time, she would find a way to address it honestly. I hoped she would tell you. She looked at me directly when she said this. She did not. She had discovered that Vivian had entered the relationship with me with knowledge that she was not in a position to build the life she was presenting, and had made the decision to proceed anyway. Had made the further decision to manage the concealment throughout the engagement, including during conversations about financial planning that I had been having in good faith. I had a conversation with Vivian, Eliza continued, approximately 3 months before you arrived at this house the last time. She meant the Sunday gathering. I told her that what she was doing was not fair, that it would be discovered, that she needed to tell you. Her voice remained steady, which was a remarkable thing to watch. She told me she had it handled, that you would understand once you were married, that the situation was improving. Eliza paused. None of those things were true. The hallway argument that Josephine had witnessed, the one before I arrived on that Sunday, had been a final version of this same conversation. Eliza had learned I was coming. She had known from something in the communications that morning that I had put things together. She had tried, in the hallway, to tell Vivian that the hour was done, that she needed to speak first, to speak honestly, before I arrived. Vivian had refused. And then the next revelation came. The one that changed the shape of everything, including things I hadn't known. Everett. He had not appeared, as I had assumed, after the breakup. He had been a presence in Vivian's life, not romantically, at first, but as a figure she had been in contact with, specifically about the financial situation, for a period that predated our breakup by over 4 months. What he had offered her was not romance, but a solution of a kind, a connection to resources and a lifestyle that might, she had apparently calculated, allow her to manage the transition from me if the concealment failed. He was not a love story. He was a contingency plan. Eliza knew this because Vivian had made the mistake, once, of having a conversation in her childhood home when she believed her mother was not nearby. Eliza had not eavesdropped deliberately. She had heard enough. She had not been certain enough of the context to say anything at the time. But the subsequent months had confirmed what she'd heard. The table was silent in a way that had physical quality. Not stunned exactly. Stunned implies a suddenness that this particular silence didn't have. It was more like the silence of a room in which everyone is doing the same arithmetic at once and arriving, at different speeds, at the same result. Vivian's aunt sat with her hands flat on the table. Her expression had gone through several things in rapid sequence and arrived at something that was not quite neutrality. One of the cousins had her eyes on her plate. Genevieve was looking at no one. She was looking at the middle distance in the way that people look when they are absorbing information that confirms something they suspected but had not allowed themselves to fully believe. Vivian herself. I had been watching her throughout, not with satisfaction. That's not what I felt, but with the helpless attention you pay to something you've been anticipating for a long time. Her face had done something I'd never seen it do in 3 years. It had stopped performing. What was underneath the performance was not villainous. It was smaller than that, and in some ways more painful to see. It was the face of a person who had constructed a structure very carefully and was watching it come down all at once and could not find the words. She said, "Mom." Just that. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Eliza looked at her daughter with an expression that contained multitudes, grief, love, and exhausted resolution. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry it happened this way. I'm more sorry that any other way was taken from me." Then she looked around the table. "He walked away because he was honest enough to do so," she said, meaning me, when the facts became clear to him. What he chose not to do, in all the months since, was expose any of this when it could have protected his reputation but damaged people who were not responsible for the situation. He carried it quietly. She paused. "That cost him something. I've been watching it cost him. I thought somebody should say so." Reed, at the far end of the table, was looking at me. His expression now was fully decodable. It was the expression of a man who had been holding a question for months and had just received its answer. Harrison beside me made the smallest exhale. Graham, a few seats down, had his hands folded and was looking at the table with the particular stillness of a person trying to keep their face completely neutral while experiencing a strong internal response. The 11 minutes were over. The table remained still. The rest of the afternoon resolved itself the way these things do, slowly, imperfectly, with the awkward human machinery that follows a revelation at a family dinner. Vivian's aunt came to find me near the end of the evening, when the gathering had thinned and small groups were either helping clean or finding their coats. She was a woman who had always been warm to me before the breakup and cold after it, and who now seemed to be recalibrating in real time. She didn't have a speech. She just put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "I didn't know." And I told her I knew she didn't, and that was the whole of it. Josephine found me near the door. She said something similar, with more words, and at the end of the something similar she said, "I noticed something was off that day. I should have trusted it." Which I thought was generous, because whatever she'd noticed hadn't been enough to prompt a question at the time, and I didn't blame her for that. The story Vivian told was well constructed and delivered with conviction. Reed shook my hand on the way out. He held the handshake a beat longer than usual, which in Reed's economy of expression was the equivalent of a speech. The apologies arrived in the following days and weeks. Not dramatically, not with the kind of ceremony that public ruptures sometimes generate, the full-scale reversals and public recantations. They came quietly, by text and by phone call, from people who had drifted away during the months of the social media narrative and were now, with the new information, doing the private accounting of how they'd behaved and finding it not quite satisfactory. A college friend who had commented on Vivian's post sent me a message that was 2 paragraphs and not quite sufficient, but clearly genuine. A distant family member called to say they'd heard things that apparently contradicted what had been said, and was I okay? Even Genevieve, who had begun her own reckoning weeks earlier, sent a message that was careful and honest, and did not ask me to perform any particular response. I accepted all of it with as much grace as I could manage. Not because I had been transformed into a saint by my experience, but because I understood that people believe the stories available to them, and Vivian's story had been available and mine had not, and that was a condition I had chosen. I had made the calculation, consciously, to wait rather than counter. That meant accepting that the interim costs were mine to carry. The rumors did not die immediately. Rumors never die immediately. They just lose their oxygen supply and begin to shrink. Over the weeks following Thanksgiving, the version of events that had circulated in the mutual network began to be revised by new information, quietly, without ceremony. The narrative of the man who had publicly humiliated his fiancée out of some combination of cowardice and cruelty was replaced by something more complicated and less satisfying for clean storytelling purposes, which is perhaps why it spread more slowly. Vivian disappeared from the social landscape she had occupied. Not entirely. She kept her accounts. She continued to exist, but with a drastically reduced frequency and with a different quality to what she did post. The empowerment content stopped. The curated couple content was long gone. What remained, occasionally, were the kind of posts that don't perform anything. A photo of a meal, a view from somewhere, small neutral things. She did not contact me. I did not contact her. I held no particular feeling about this. I had cared for her. I had been willing to build a life with her. What I had not been willing to do, once I understood the full picture, was enter that life on terms that required me to be something other than what I was. To be a financial solution presented as a love story, to be managed rather than loved, to continue making the calculation of not worth it here indefinitely. The reality of what had happened was its own consequence. Not mine to deliver, not requiring my administration. It simply was. The offer came through in late January. The collaboration I'd been working toward, the firm, the project, the thing that had been building quietly through all of it, came together with the specific efficiency that things have when they've been well prepared. I signed the agreement on a Thursday morning. I told Graham that evening over a beer that I'd been trying not to make too much of for months, and he made exactly the right amount of it, which was a fair amount, handled with characteristic unsentimental joy. I moved apartments in February. Not far, still Brooklyn, still within walking distance of the things I valued about where I lived. But new space, new light, the specific satisfaction of choosing an environment without accommodation, without negotiation, without the half-conscious compromise that you don't recognize as such until it's gone. Spring came with its particular quality in this city, the sudden decision of warmth after months of gray, and the way people emerge from themselves slightly. I ran most mornings. I cooked. I had dinners with people I genuinely wanted to see, and the dinners had the quality that comes when you are not performing anything for anyone. Graham and I met for our walk one Saturday in March. The city was one of those days where the light seemed to have been adjusted slightly in favor of optimism, and we covered our usual loop without needing to fill all the silence. She deleted the post, he said at one point. I didn't pretend not to know which one. When, a couple weeks ago, Genevieve noticed. I thought about it for half a block. The post with the crown emoji, the 247 likes, the 247 separate moments of someone affirming a story I had known to be inverted. Gone now. Quietly, without announcement. How does that feel? Graham asked. Honest answer. It felt like very little. Not because I was past the pain. I was not entirely past all of it, nor did I expect to be on any particular schedule, but because the post had never been the thing. It had been a symptom of a thing, and the thing itself had already resolved in the only way it could resolve. Through time, through truth finding its own surface, through the quiet accumulation of a reality that was different from the story told about it. Fine, I said, which was true. You never defended yourself publicly, he said. Do you ever wonder if you should have? I thought about it seriously, because Graham's questions deserve serious consideration. The defense would have required me to harm people who didn't deserve to be collateral, I said. And it would have required me to trust that the defense would be heard accurately, which I couldn't guarantee. I looked at the street in front of us, and it would have required me to believe that what other people thought of me was more important than what I knew. He nodded. Was it worth it? He said. Waiting. I didn't answer immediately. We walked another half block. The city moved around us, doing what it always does, indifferent and full and alive. Ask me again in a year, I said. He laughed. I will. We kept walking. Somewhere across the city, a post was gone. Somewhere, a mother was carrying the aftermath of a dinner that had cost her something, that had come from love even if love is not always clean. Somewhere, a relationship that had been a performance had finished its final act. And I was here, walking in the spring light, full of nothing in particular and everything I'd chosen. I had not needed to defend myself. I had not needed to expose anyone. I had only needed to wait and work and refuse to become smaller than I was, not as a strategy, not as a gambit, but simply because it was the only version of living I had left that felt like mine. The truth never needed my defense. It only needed time.